Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and try a bit quicker, the Vesica Pisces, Vesica Piscis, Sacred Geometry, and the Sacred Geometry of Architecture, and how it connects between multiple cultures across a long time. And so, looking at Borobudur in Indonesia, this very famous temple, and there's quite a bit to say about it, but I'll just be focusing on this particular part where a survey conducted in 1971, I think it was, revealed multiple ratios of 4 to 6 and to 9 as well, indicating the architect used fractal or self-similar geometry in the design. So that emerges from the vesica, which leads to the flower of life and how these systems grow. Also the mandala, not to be confused with the mandorla, but the mandala is also this pattern built into not just Borobudur, but also Prambanan and Hindu Buddhist temples as well. But this ratio of 4, 6, 9, and how does that connect? So here we see some of the cross sections, and we see the 4 to 6 to 9, and the 2 to 3, and the 9. Now 4 is, well, 4 to 6, sorry, is a 2 to 3 ratio, and 4, 6, and 9, well, 2 squared, and 9 is 3 squared as well. Now, we'll be seeing this in many other places, but let's look at the Vesica Piscis, this Pisces, the 2 to 3 ratio inherent in there, which is important in music theory as well, but 2 to 3. So 4 to 6 is 2 to 3, and 6 to 9 is a 2 to 3 ratio. So you can see how the Vesica, whether that was the pattern or not, is not important. Is that ancient architects across time, across the world, cross cultures, always come back not just the same numbers, but also to the same ratios and proportions, which are then reflected in the measurement systems as well, which is a curious feature because, well, if it was just if they just sort of knew these geometric ratios, okay, this can be developed independently, but that multiple cultures cross time, across the world, always come back to the same number systems, and that's reflected not just in proportion but in the units of measure. That's very significant. That is really important and overlooked, because the standard view is that all the cultures developed independently. Only later period did they have influence, but for instance the Indus, China, Sumer, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, that they all developed independently, and it just so happens to be pure coincidence that all the, not just the ratios, numbers in symbolism, but also the units of measure come back to these same set of numbers. But that's off on a rant. So just to begin with, a 2 to 3 ratio using the vesica, where you can see how the vesica aligned vertically as opposed to horizontally gives a 2 to 3 ratio. Now 3 squared is 9. We could look into that as well. So it's 2 to 3 ratio. But you see the same thing here. So if the foot of the temple is 4 and the body is 6, that's a 2 to 3 ratio. So once again, just twisting the vesica 90 degrees, you get this pattern happening. Now this is interesting because I've done plenty of videos in the past on this, so let's just skip over so many other temples, including megalith temples in France and the UK, and over to across the Mediterranean, over to, well, everywhere really, but the famous Parthenon. And this has a length to width ratio and a width to height ratio of 9 to 4. Well, what's 9 to 4? Well, 3 squared is 9 and 2 squared is 4. But also there have been many studies on this. You can just look, well, this 9 to 4 ratio, well, throughout the temple, because from a 3 to 2 you can construct a 9 to 4 ratio, but the actual 2 to 3 ratio is the important part, the inherent part within there, and that can be found throughout the Parthenon as well. But this links several of the grandest pyramids in Egypt. For instance, the Red Pyramid, the base is at a 3 to 2 ratio to the height of the Great Pyramid, and the Pyramid of Khafre is at a 3 to 2 width to height ratio as well. So the pyramids and the Parthenon, which also incorporate all these other lovely proportions and these units of measure which come back to the same numbers as well, but it's still being practiced now, and especially through the modern esoteric Hermetic traditions, include, for instance, Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg in Canada, the foundation stone laid on a very significant day, but also the width to the height of the building, 2 to 3, or the Hermetic constant as it's called. Frank Albo's done a lot of work on Winnipeg, but also here in Australia, Governor Lachlan Macquarie, from the street widths to, well, proportions, layouts, you name it, he set the pattern for the street plan, town planning in Australia, which is just overflowing with significant important numbers, and again built off this geometry. So for instance, the towns that when he arrived, he redesigned some towns to make them fit this plan better, but he also set up a number of towns from scratch, and he included Pythagorean theorem, especially the vesica here, this 2 to 3 ratio, or 8 by 12 chains. 2 to 3 ratio. So, but it's also repeated in other ways in Borobudur. And so, for instance, there are 72 Buddha statues on the circular top platforms, 432 Buddha statues on the lesser ones. But just to focus on this top pattern, and to begin with, we have 72 on 3 layers, which is 32 and 24 and 16, which also gives this, so 16 to 24, you could simplify it, divide it by 16 by 8 is 2, and 24 divided by 8 is 3, so a 3 to 2 ratio. But also beneath that, 32 to 24 is a 3 to 4 ratio, which again incorporates this important vesica feature, would be a Pythagorean triangle. Now that all relates back to Pythagorean music as well, and I believe it's much older than, same with Pythagorean theorem, much older than what the credit would go. But we see again this 3 to 2 and 3 to 4 music ratio still with us today, one of the basis of music theory. So what you find is that ancient Egypt, well, pretty much across the world, these architectural structures, these grand ones, these are not just some random, they went to massive efforts to put these things together, and the architects all seem to be either working off the same tradition, or, well, how do they get to, because you can find this in important modern cathedrals, up to the modern, even modernist architecture, buildings connected to people who clearly practice this older tradition. But you find it in the, well, ancient structures as well. So this Borobudur's been about the 10th century, maybe 8th century, not sure exact date at the moment, I can't remember offhand, but, well, over 1,000 years old. And in much older temple, in the Eastern Mediterraneans, back to megalith sites in all in France and the UK, and you'll find it also repeated so often in even Egyptian temples, especially the older places as well. So the question really is this, can this really be called a coincidence? And that sort of seems to be the standard model, because there is this, well, it's been basically written down as a law that all these cultures aren't really connected. If it is, it's just it's more to say they are not connected, that they develop their units of measure independently, that they so beautifully connect and harmonize at very special numbers as well. This is just not tackled by the mainstream, if you want to call it that. Well, actually it is, because there are many mainstream historians, architectural historians, archaeologists who do talk about this. They just don't get traction very much. They're, I suppose, a bit like, there are gatekeepers in the establishment view. There are also gatekeepers in, let's just call it, the alternative view. And there has been I admit I have a confirmation bias myself, but seems both sides of this argument have been polarized, and nothing that's outside of the dogmatic view, the orthodoxy, even including the unorthodox side of the debate. But what we do is you do find these things repeated again and again. So is it a global symphony of coincidence across time, across cultures, back to the beginning of recorded history? Is it a pattern which is being passed on through travel and trade? And the more artifacts that are found, we find that the ancient trade routes are much larger and much older than what is generally accepted. Even the the mainstream views of things like the typical BBC documentaries really haven't caught up with the bulk of the findings. Or the third question is this like something in our DNA? Are these, just like human beings are drawn towards symmetry and, well, harmony as well. Like, you can't just, a bit like that newfangled classical music, which is all discordant. It's, maybe the people in it can appreciate it because of the technicalities of it, but to the person listening to it, it's just horrible. It's discordant, and we lend towards symmetry. We lend ourselves towards harmony. It is in us, but this is the $64,000 question. Has it been passed on? Is it pure coincidence? Well, really, you can just throw that out the window. Or is it part of is there a book or a system of teaching that has been passed down through time, connecting all these other cultures? I would lean between, there has been teachings, but there is also an element where it is like literally in our evolution, in our DNA, that we love these things. We're drawn to symmetry. We're drawn to harmony. Like when we hear a pleasant note, it's generally 99% of the time, most people will favour the harmonious note. Some people will be drawn to the discordant. Some people are drawn to the asymmetric. But generally speaking, as an overwhelming majority, we like harmony and we like symmetry, and this seems to be built into the architecture. And so these features in Borobudur, where is some? Okay, there's a mandala. Okay, so this is an example of a Borobudur plan, also in Prambanan, and, well, again, the Vasta Shastru and this ancient teachings, which are known about in the East, but can be also found in the West as well. So anyway, 2 to 3 ratio, the Vesica, and how it can link so many apparently separated cultures, and especially through the architecture and systems of weights and measure, because I think that's the key one. Because with weights and measure and these architectural proportions, you can really lock it. It really is posing a question because you can weigh it, you can measure it, and that these things come together is very significant. And I think one of the best ways to challenge the orthodox view on things, because it can't be lost in translation. You can, till the cows come home, you can argue the meaning of symbols. You can argue the connection or similarities between various legends, but there will always be this reasonable doubt in there that can be inserted because it's just hard to pin it down. However, with the use of specific measures, specific proportions, and that these proportions come back to significant, important numbers, which will not only important in the religious sense, but are also based in geometry and arithmetic, beautiful numbers, and so for the architects who are designing something such as this, you have to understand maths, you have to understand geometry. You can't do it otherwise, because how do you replicate these? How do you do it without these things? And again, there's like a very strong bias that Pythagorean theorem, Delium problem, that they were solved, during the Greek period, but we find in the architecture, we find the evidence of it, again, going back across time, across cultures, archaeoastronomy especially, linking all these things as well. There really is a visible trace, measurable trace, that can be repeated, has been repeated, and is put in these grand temples. And the architects who did these, who drew up these plans, they were, how did they come to the same thing over and over and over again? So not just in a symbolic sense, but also in the measurable, tangible, what you can weigh, you can count it, and it is repeated. If it was a random world, as most often would like to be believed and described, these things would not happen. Yet they do, and they consistently, how many coincidences makes a pattern? Well, that's arbitrary, but sometimes coincidence eventually has to become, all the time. At a point, a repeated coincidence is indication of a pattern. With that, have a good one.